Hi YouTube, we are back with another homestead questions video today. So the question this past week was, how do you store your food? And there's a couple different ways that you can store food when you're off-grid. That's dependent on whether you have power or whether you don't have power. For us, because we have power, we have a power source because we're on solar, we don't necessarily have to worry about that. So I want to talk about the off-grid power side of things first, and then we'll talk about the off-grid without power, how you can store things. So being off-grid, typically people who live off-grid, and for us anyways, I make a lot of the food that we eat. Almost everything is made from scratch. Hardly anything comes out of a box. We try to make sure that we're eating as clean as possible. That's great for our bodies and it's been fantastic for physical health, but what it means is that a lot of the food does not last as long because it doesn't have, I don't cook with any sort of fillers or preservatives, and it's legitimately homemade. So I don't have the luxury of leaving bread, for example, in the bread box or in the fridge for 2 weeks or a week even. It will start going bad after about 3-4 days if we don't eat it and it's left out in the bread box at room temperature. So one way that we get around this is by freezing things. So if you freeze things, obviously that's pretty simple. You can put something in a bag, or you can vacuum seal it and make sure that it's completely airtight and stick it in a freezer. We have multiple freezers here that we use with different things that are in them, but when I cook and I make something like bread, for example, I won't just make one loaf for that day or for the next day. I will make a bunch of loaves, and what we are not eating in the next 2 days will go in the freezer. So freezing is one option. If you have power, that's a really good thing to make use of. Another option would be canning. Now you can can a lot of things. Not everything tastes great when it's canned. It has a very different taste. Fruit is very good to can. Vegetables I know you can can as well. And there are certain meats and juices. So like lemon juice, for example, you can can that. Beets, you can can that. Jams and jellies and things like that, you can can those. And at that point, once they're canned, they're then good for a much longer storage period. In which case you can either put them in the fridge or the freezer if we're still going with this idea of being on grid and needing power. So canning is another option for you. I know that you can can meats. I've not actually tried that, so we'll see how that tastes if and when we get around to it. I know you can do it. That does, however, lead me to my next point, smoking. Meat is very good when it's smoked, and it makes it last a lot longer if it is smoked, rather than if you just put it in the fridge or in the freezer. It has a different taste, obviously, because it's smoked meat, and depending on what type of meat you're smoking, it's going to be a bit of a different process to smoke it. But from what I understand, it's very easy to do. That's something that we'll be getting into later this year, is smoking meat. So that's another option for you, and that doesn't actually require you to have any sort of refrigeration necessarily. You have to smoke it beforehand and make sure that you have a smoker area to do that, and then you'd have to put it either in the fridge or the freezer if you want to store it that way. But I believe it would be fine if it's hanging just at room temperature because you've put it through the smoking process and it has that salt as a preservative for it. The next thing that you can do, if freezing is not an option, if refrigeration is not an option, if canning or smoking and then storage is not an option, something else that you can do is dehydrating. Now, you can do it with natural methods, which I'll get into in a second, or you can do it with a dehydrator. We have a dehydrator that we can use, so you quite literally just use the machine, you pull out your trays, stick whatever it is that you need to dehydrate on your trays, pull it back in or push it back in, and then turn it on, and it dehydrates it in anywhere from 4 to 6 hours or whatever it takes, depending on what food it is that you're dehydrating. Once your food is dehydrated, it's going to last a lot longer than if you were to leave it out sitting on the counter or at room temperature. I believe it does need to be refrigerated after you've dehydrated it, depending on what it is. Something like fruit is obviously going to have a very different outcome than something like meat. And so this leads me to kind of the next idea, where with certain products and certain foods, they're better in certain production methods. So meat, for example, would be great if you froze it or if you smoked it. Not necessarily the greatest if you can it or you dehydrate it. Whereas fruit, if you can it or dehydrate it or even freeze it, you can't smoke fruit. So different methods for different pieces of food, something to keep in mind. Those are ways that you can make your food last longer in terms of storing your food and making sure it has proper storage if you have a power source. Now, if you don't have a power source, that's a completely different ball game, because then you are quite literally out of luck in terms of trying to make sure that your food lasts as long as possible. At that point, you're taking it back to a prairie's perspective, back in the Middle Ages when they didn't have power. So a lot of the methods that I talked about just now with freezing and smoking and canning and dehydrating, if you don't have power, you obviously can't look at freezing as an opportunity. But you can do the other three, dehydrating and canning and smoking, because you can build a smoker that doesn't require any sort of technology. It might require some tools, but it doesn't necessarily require any power per se, because you can do things by hand. For canning, that doesn't require any power necessarily either. You can use things that are around you in nature to help you with the canning process. Dehydrating, that's another one that you can do naturally, laying things out in the sun. So if it was a beautiful day like today, you could lay out your fruits or your veggies or whatever in the sun. And I know there's a whole process to how you do that naturally, but you don't need to have power for any of those methods. If you don't have power, however, the question then becomes, well, how do I store these things so they last as long as possible? There are these things called root cellars, and I know that many people know about them or know of them, but they don't necessarily know how to do them. It's kind of been a forgotten thing of the past because we have refrigerators. If you think of root cellars, they're like underground refrigerators. Because if you think of the ground is colder the deeper that you go down. So if you dig a root cellar into the ground, that's actually your best bet. Now, I'm not a construction person. I'm not giving any advice as to who should build your root cellar for you. I definitely suggest getting somebody who is experienced in the construction world to do that, or to help you with that sort of construction knowledge, because I myself don't have that knowledge. But I do know that root cellars are a very good idea in terms of storage. And it's like nature's refrigerator. We have a root cellar. I use it for a lot of things, for storage, so that we don't necessarily have to use our fridge. And that way I'm not necessarily having to use the fridge all the time. So having a root cellar, if you are out of power, if you're interested in making sure that you have storage for as long as possible for your food, having a root cellar, I would say, is an absolute must. Because you can still dehydrate things, you can still can things, and you can still smoke things, but they're only going to last so long if you don't have a proper method of storage. So building a root cellar, or a cold room perhaps in your house, if you don't have the access to be digging in your backyard, or digging wherever you're located, and you don't have the resources to build a root cellar, I know that you can build cold rooms inside your house. There's a certain way you have to set that up too. So those would be my suggestions for long-term storage, or for longer-term storage if you're trying to make your food last as long as possible. Thanks for listening, guys. I'll see you on the next one.